Despite all efforts aimed at ensuring safety, women continue to be one of the most vulnerable groups of the population, exposed to the highest risk of encountering dangerous individuals. Statistics show that most crimes are committed against females. Sometimes, to avoid tragic consequences, it is enough to simply be vigilant and attentive to your surroundings. Elementary caution can prevent misfortune, such as using only one earphone instead of two or taking an extra turn of the head to notice a potential threat in time. Do not neglect these simple rules, as they can save lives. Criminals are constantly trying to outsmart law enforcement, and some of them succeed. But in the era of advanced technologies, it is almost impossible to go unnoticed. Every hair will be detected and examined, even if it does not belong to a human. On July 23, 2000, a former judge went for a walk on Merritt Island, Florida, USA. He intended to inspect his vessel, moored at the pier. Strolling along the wooden deck and admiring his boat, he suddenly noticed something suspicious in the water out of the corner of his eye. Leaning over to get a better look, the man smelled a strong odor of decomposition. In these parts, it was not uncommon. The carcass of a marine animal could have easily drifted here, as had happened before. The witness had repeatedly come across the bodies of manatees and assumed that this could be one of them. He called a special service to have the remains removed. However, when specialists arrived at the call, it became apparent that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. In fact, the body of a girl who had clearly died a violent death had drifted to the pier. Law enforcement officers were called to the pier. Officers from the local sheriff's department reacted instantly and arrived at the specified location. Assessing the condition of the body, they were only convinced that the girl had become a victim of murder. Given that the remains were in the water, they needed to be retrieved to the surface as quickly and carefully as possible. The longer the deceased remained there, the more physical evidence could be washed away and irretrievably lost. A team of divers was involved for this task, who descended underwater with a special bag and then pulled the body to the surface. They used equipment that, after being pulled ashore, drains all the water and tightly fits the body. This is necessary to preserve as much physical evidence as possible for further investigation. The detectives noticed that the stage of decomposition was not the latest. Bloating had not yet begun. The unknown girl had spent several days in the river. She was without clothes, but the police found torn garbage bags on her legs. The victim's arms and legs were tied with rope, as well as several layers of tape. While the rope was used only for the limbs, the tape covered the entire body, including the head. It seemed that the criminal was desperately trying to silence her by tightly wrapping her face. The deceased had her mouth, eyes, nose, and even ears taped. In addition, the police were sure that this was an attempt to deprive her of any chance of surviving the execution. It was not possible to immediately identify the victim. She had no personal belongings or documents for identification with her. Investigators immediately got to work on the murder investigation. It was evident that the girl had been tortured for a long time, possibly raped. But to finally understand what had happened, a comprehensive analysis was needed. It began with obtaining the victim's fingerprints, which were taken by an expert in this field who arrived at the crime scene along with the police squad. All of this was supposed to help with identification. A big problem for the detectives was the fact that water very effectively erases any evidence, including DNA samples and the criminal's fingerprints. In the few days that the body had spent in the river, there might not be anything valuable left for the investigation at all. A simple examination was clearly not enough. A full-fledged examination on the medical examiner's table was needed. In addition to the impact of water, great damage was caused by the heat, which accelerated decomposition, so the body was immediately sent to the laboratory. At the same time, forensic experts began analyzing the physical evidence found at the crime scene. First of all, they were interested in the unusual rope. It had a distinctive red and white pattern with a double diamond-shaped stitch. Even if this did not make the item unique, it clearly narrowed down the search area. Forensic experts found that it was a particularly strong nylon rope. It had singed ends to avoid fraying. All of this suggested that it was used not by a random person, but by someone with professional knowledge. The black rubber cord, in which the garbage bags on the legs were found to be fixed, also attracted attention. The The bags themselves were badly torn. According to forensic experts, they were initially used to give weight to the body and not allow it to float to the surface. Stones or other ballast could have been thrown inside. Logically, the bags were supposed to keep the victim at the bottom of the reservoir. But due to the current, they were torn by stones and other sharp objects in the water. The contents spilled out. After a couple of days, the remains were able to rise to the surface. After analysis, forensic experts found that this black cord is a seal for window openings. They were most interested in the numerous scraps of tape, since the sticky layer on it could contain evidence. From the investigators' experience, when using such material, people unconsciously leave their fingerprints and particles of their skin on it, at least on both ends of each piece when tearing it off the reel. This physical evidence could lead to the criminal. Unfortunately, the police were unable to detect a sufficient amount of material on the tape scraps. Only after an in-depth analysis, a few stuck black hairs were found on it, which clearly did not belong to Misty. The young woman had chestnut-colored hair, so the detectives find obviously belonged to someone else and could point to the criminal. Having collected all these materials at the scene of the tragedy, the police sent them for analysis. All hopes were pinned on the autopsy, since this time fortune was not on the side of the investigation. There were not enough materials to obtain any valuable information with the level of technology in 2000. The medical examiner was convinced that the body had been in the water for about 3 days. The worst fears were confirmed. The water had managed to erase almost everything. Even the exact cause of death could not be determined by the specialist. No traces of male fluid were found on the body, but given the circumstances, this did not rule out rape. However, all these efforts were not in vain, as they helped to partially reconstruct the picture of the tragic events that preceded the girl's death. Combining all the collected information, law enforcement officers came to disappointing conclusions. In fact, they had almost nothing of value that could indicate the direction of the search. No gunshot wounds, broken bones, signs of struggle, or violence were found on the examined body. The only suspicious detail was indistinct strangulation marks on the neck. It was assumed that the girl could have died from the tape that covered her mouth and nose, or she was strangled before ending up in the river. Despite the presence of water in the lungs and stomach, this did not provide grounds to believe that the victim had choked after drowning. Given the amount of time the girl had spent in the river, the fluid had naturally filled the body. However, there were also some developments. The medical examiner established the identity of the deceased by her fingerprints. She turned out to be 22-year-old Misty Morse, who was described as a cheerful, friendly, and sociable person. Everything her loved ones said about her sounded very positive. Misty loved her friends and parties, which was consistent with her age. But she always stayed away from bad company and was not involved with the criminal world or prohibited substances. Instead, Misty thought a lot about her future. If she was not spending time with friends, she was preparing for college classes. Misty was not frivolous. On the contrary, she took her studies seriously. However, she believed that this period should be spent not only on endless studying and work but also on entertainment. On July 24, 2000, detectives went to the home of the Morse family, located in Indian Harbor Beach, Florida. They were met by Misty's mother. For the woman, it was a great shock. She immediately turned to her husband and the biological father of the victim. Everyone was stunned by the news that the girl had been murdered. The mother could barely stand on her feet from this terrible news. She really wanted to know who had dared to take her girl away. Unfortunately, the police had nothing to report on this matter. On the contrary, the officers came to the mother not only to inform her about the death of her daughter but also to get a lead on the likely killer. The woman could not imagine that in Misty's immediate circle there could be reasons for such a cruel act. In recent years, the daughter had no problematic relationships or potentially dangerous friends. Moreover, the mother was in a state of shock and generally had difficulty connecting her thoughts. However, the investigators insisted that she needed to provide at least some information so that they could continue the investigation. It was necessary to at least obtain data on Misty's last known whereabouts. The mother recalled that 4 days before these events, on July 20, 2000, Misty had returned home, beaming with excitement. She took a shower, dried her hair, got dressed, and was about to go out again. At the exit, she and her mother ran into each other and exchanged a couple of jokes. Suddenly, Misty's cell phone rang. At first, she ignored the call, but on the second one, she was forced to answer. It seemed that Misty was hiding something. To exchange a couple of words with the person on the phone, she left the room. Then Misty returned more serious, informing that she needed to leave. Usually, she was sociable, but that evening she behaved secretively, which looked somewhat suspicious. Misty promised to return the next day, but after that, no message came from her. The woman continued to remember. On July 21st, the mother went to work and spent the whole day there. In the evening, the daughter was also not at home. The woman did not attach any importance to this, since Misty often stayed overnight with her girlfriends and could stay with them for several days. Only the complete absence of phone calls and messages from the girl seemed suspicious. By the morning of the next day, the mother began to worry a lot. Despite the fact that the daughter could be absent for several days, she always reported where she was, and if she promised to arrive at a certain time, she was never late. Neither the father nor the girl's friends could get through to Misty. According to Linda, the next day, the daughter was also absent. On July 24th, Linda was going to go to the police station in the evening to report the disappearance. However, before she could do so, the worst nightmare of her life was confirmed. Investigators appeared on the doorstep and told about the terrible discovery made in a nearby river. Linda insisted that she wanted to help in every possible way, so she allowed the detectives to conduct searches in the deceased's room. Everything was as usual here, with the exception of one strange detail. Misty's purse was lying on the table, seeming untouched. Inside were all the necessary items for daily use, with the exception of a cell phone and driver's license. Obviously, when Misty left the house, she was not going to stay away for long and planned to return as soon as possible. In addition, it was clear that the last person who contacted Misty was someone well acquainted with her. Probably, it was with him that she spoke on the phone just before leaving. After a detailed presentation of the events by the mother of the deceased, the detectives decided to check the records of Misty call log. Linda's words were confirmed. 2 calls were made to Misty's cell phone on the evening when they last saw each other. After that, Misty spoke with an unknown number twice more. The first time, just before midnight, the dialogue lasted several minutes. After a short break, another call came in, which lasted only a few seconds. Unfortunately, the officers were unable to establish to whom the number belonged. Thus, at this stage, the detectives also reached a dead end. They decided to focus on the few pieces of evidence collected on the victim's body. The rope with a characteristic red and white pattern aroused the greatest interest. After analyzing this evidence, it was possible to find out that it was a specific item from a set of equipment used in sailing. The adhesive tape, which was initially mistaken for reinforced tape for household repairs, also turned out to be special equipment used in sailing. Usually, such materials are used for temporary repair of sails literally on the go. It has great strength and a strong adhesive layer capable of withstanding loads. The conclusions suggested themselves. Probably, the detectives needed a person well acquainted with sailing, or one who served in the Navy or worked at sea. The detectives again turned to the family of the deceased. It was assumed that the incident could be related to the girl's young people. Linda told about Misty's previous relationships. The police were interested in 2 young men, Ted Underwood and Bobby Cooper. Both turned out to be former boyfriends with whom the relationship lasted shortly before the tragedy. As it seemed to the investigation, they could have a motive for murder, at least jealousy. The most attention was drawn to Ted, since the young man had a long criminal history, despite his young age. The list of episodes included several crimes related to sexual harassment and burglary. According to the mother of the murdered girl, Misty and Ted agreed to meet and went on a single date, after which the girl showed no interest. The police suspected that Ted was one of those people who could not accept rejection. All this could provoke an attack by a novice criminal. Ted was immediately brought in for questioning. Contrary to the expectations of law enforcement officers, he turned out to be a sociable young man. He willingly cooperated. The guy provided the police with all the information they were interested in. He agreed to provide materials for DNA analysis. According to Ted, they really saw Misty once. It happened on the day of her disappearance. However, according to the guy, he was also not interested in continuing this connection, so the couple broke up on a friendly note. According to Ted, they met on the internet and communicated for some time before meeting. The date was appointed as a friendly meeting to get to know each other better and understand intentions. Despite the friendliness of the young man, the police continued to suspect that his behavior was a trick. In this way, he could try to lull the vigilance and divert the suspicions of the police from himself. However, Ted did not refuse to cooperate, even when he was asked to conduct a search of the house where he lived. In the process, the police failed to find anything suspicious that could link Ted to the crime. He also had no military background or interest in the sea, so the guy was excluded from the list of suspects. Moreover, he had an alibi for the entire evening and night on the day of the murder. The next possible suspect was Bobby. He was most interested in the detectives by the fact that he used his own boat. The guy clearly had an idea of what special tape for emergency sail repair and rope with a special thread weave were. The young man had no military experience. However, he frankly admitted his romantic feelings for Misty. This reinforced the suspicions. Shortly before the murder, he tried to contact the girl to establish a relationship. The guy was shocked by the news that Misty had died. The young man also did not deny the police access to the house and provided all the necessary tests. He had no criminal past, no connection with substances, or problems with addictions. In general, Bobby looked like a positive character who could not kill his secret love. During the interrogation, the young man behaved emotionally. It seemed that he was genuinely worried about what had happened. The police were already ready to believe his words when a message arrived that Misty's driver's license had been found in Cooper's house. Now Bobby supplemented his story by saying that he had been communicating with Misty for a long time, and she had been to his place several times. On one of these visits, Misty forgot her license. However, nothing compromising other than this was found. Bobby also had an alibi for the entire period when the reprisal against Misty was probably committed. He was crossed off the list of suspects. Suddenly, at the end of the interrogation, Bobby Cooper mentioned Misty's ex-boyfriend, whom the girl had told him about shortly before the murder. What surprised him the most was that she described this person as a Navy SEAL. Bobby could not remember his name, but this information aroused the interest of the investigators. Against this background, the detectives decided to obtain data from the parents of the murdered girl. Linda remembered that among her daughter's former boyfriends was a certain Brent Huck. He indeed turned out to be a former serviceman. At the time of the relationship, the young man was 28 years old. The couple had been dating for quite a long time. Linda emphasized that she did not approve of this connection, since her daughter's chosen one seemed too rough a guy. Misty constantly complained about him. Brent behaved too aggressively towards the girl, and without visible reasons. According to her, he even resorted to physical force, trying to achieve submission. Eventually, they broke up. Linda did not tell about him right away, since at the time of the murder, more than a year had passed since the young people had broken up. The mother was sure that they no longer met or communicated, but she was mistaken. The detectives checked Brent Huck through the database. Several alarming details were immediately noted. First, Brent had a military background and worked as the captain of a charter boat directly at the time of Misty's murder. He lived on Merritt Island, not far from where Misty's body was found. Obviously, he had access to special marine equipment and possessed the necessary skills to use it, so he seemed to be a suitable candidate for the role of the killer. Of course, Brent was detained and brought in for questioning. Here, the young man proved to be ready to cooperate, but it felt like he was tense and seemed to be waiting for some kind of trick. Despite attempts to calm him down, he remained vigilant. In addition, Brent seemed even too indifferent when he was told the news about the death of his former girlfriend. The investigators managed to find out that the couple continued to meet as friends, while their entourage spoke about the breakup of the relationship. Despite the fact that both regularly saw each other up until the very last day of Misty's life, it seemed that Brent did not feel any emotions at all. This reaction persisted throughout the entire interrogation with the police. It seemed really strange, unlike the behavior of the previous suspects. The longer the interview lasted, the more the young man tried to denigrate his former girlfriend. According to him, Misty was promiscuous. He spoke very negatively about her character and behavior. Closer to the end of the interrogation, Brent reported that he was the person who made several calls to the murdered girl on the evening of her disappearance. He admitted that they still maintained an intimate relationship. The detectives continued to communicate with the main suspect, trying to obtain any valuable information. It seemed that he knew everything about Misty, with whom and when she spent time, what she did in the company of other young people. This looked suspicious, as if he was collecting information and analyzing every move of his ex-girlfriend. The police tried to find out what exactly was discussed during the last calls from the young man on the evening when the crime was committed. According to Brent, he heard from one of his friends that Misty was spreading a story about her pregnancy, naming him as the father of the child. Then he called Misty and demanded that she stop this slander, since at that time both were in relationships with other young people. Brent stated that he was alarmed by this story because he was afraid of ruining his relationship with his new girlfriend. The young man insisted that he did not meet with Misty in person that evening, but only spoke on the phone. During the first, longer call, he expressed his claims to her, and the young people discussed everything. During the second, short call, he made sure that everything was fine and that Misty understood him correctly. The police were skeptical about this story, since no signs of pregnancy were found after the autopsy. However, they continued to have an intimate relationship with Misty, which provided a strong motive. Could he be so afraid of his girlfriend's pregnancy that he was ready to cold-bloodedly deal with a defenseless girl? According to the police, Misty could really spread rumors about pregnancy, which was confirmed by several witnesses. However, whether it was the result of a mistake or an intentional action, it was never possible to find out. The detectives were convinced that when Brent heard this information, he panicked, so he wanted to clarify this issue in person. Perhaps there was a meeting between the young people, a conflict occurred that got out of control. However, the suspect denied such an assumption by the detectives, insisting on his innocence. The young man was found to have abrasions on his hands. They could well have been received during the struggle with the victim. In response to police questions, Brent claimed that the dog pulled him on a skateboard during a walk. Suddenly the pet jerked and knocked Brent to the asphalt. The young man assured that this was how the abrasions appeared. A warrant was obtained to search Brent's property. An important piece of evidence was found in the house almost immediately, namely, garbage bags identical to those found on the victim's legs. These were special bags that were sold only in the public supermarket. They were made in the same month and year. In the garage, it was possible to find window seals, which also coincided with the evidence collected on the victim's body. There was also sail tape and rope with reinforced weaving in the house. All this coincided with the items that immobilized Misty. Finally, everything converged at one point. The investigators had the criminal in their hands, so they turned to the prosecutor's office. However, the district attorney found the evidence gathered insufficient to start a trial. More information and confirmation of the criminal's guilt was needed, in addition to circumstantial evidence. Unfortunately, nothing new could be found for quite a long time. The detectives had no choice but to watch the likely killer continue to live his life and roam free. The relatives of the deceased were horrified, because they were also convinced of Brent's guilt. He was under investigation as a suspect, but all this did not move the process from a dead point. Within a few weeks after Misty's death, information about this case leaked to the media. The family hoped that the public would help launch it all with renewed vigor, but the interest of the press did not help. A year passed from the moment of the crime, but nothing changed. All this time, Misty's parents tried to put pressure on the police to achieve justice for their daughter. During this period, the detectives continued to work on the case, investigating even the smallest leads. It seemed that the case had thoroughly reached a dead end, but law enforcement officers did not give up. Suddenly, in the fall of 2002, valuable information came from one of the genetic laboratories in Davis, California, but it was not quite what the investigators were expecting. As it turned out, the black hair found on the tape from the deceased's body was not human, but belonged to a dog. The detectives immediately recalled the story about the torn hands because of the pet and remembered that they had seen a black dog in Brent's house. The police wondered if it was possible to identify not only people but also animals by their hair. It turned out that this was indeed possible. At that time, there was already such a case. During the analysis, it was possible to find out that the suspect's dog had the same type of coat as the hair found on the tape. It was a unique individual, a cross between a Rottweiler and a German Shepherd. There could be no coincidence. This information was a real breakthrough. It seemed that now the police had sufficient grounds to bring charges. On October 23, 2002, Brent was arrested on charges of murdering Misty Morse. The young man insisted that he could not have committed this cold-blooded murder. The prosecution believed that the motive was fear that Misty had become pregnant by him. The young man believed that if their connection was revealed, he could lose his new girlfriend, whom he loved very much. The prosecution provided numerous circumstantial evidence, as well as the results of the analysis of the dog's hair, which pointed to the criminal. The killer's lawyer insisted that the case was completely fabricated, since no one more suitable could be found. The defender tried to whitewash the criminal's image, referring to Misty's promiscuity. This caused outrage among the relatives. She was a decent girl who did not deserve such a fate. The defendant's defense insisted that the medical examiner could not even accurately determine the cause of the victim's death. There was neither a weapon nor witnesses who could point to Brent. But all the lawyer's efforts were in vain. In May 2003, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder under aggravating circumstances, as well as kidnapping. Brent was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. All his appeals were rejected. To this day, Brent is serving his sentence in a Florida correctional facility. Despite the obvious connection of the young man with the crime, the motive is still not clear. Brent never pleaded guilty, did not express remorse, and continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder. To some, it seems that the explanation for the motive related to the fictitious pregnancy is far-fetched. However, what then could be the motivation to deal with Misty and throw her into the river? The story of Misty Morse's murder is a chilling and tragic tale of the brutal taking of the life of a young girl who had her whole life ahead of her. Despite the thorough work of investigators, the evidence and testimony gathered, the full picture of what happened on that fateful night still remains not fully understood. The conviction of Brent Huck to life imprisonment was the result of the persistent work of law enforcement officers who did not give up, even when the case seemed to have reached a dead end. However, the motives for the crime still raise questions. Was the fear of Misty's possible pregnancy really the cause, or were there perhaps some other, hidden motivations? This story reminds us of the importance of vigilance and caution, especially for young women. It also demonstrates how important even the smallest details, such as a hair from a pet, can be in solving even the most intricate crimes. If you are interested in this and other fascinating stories about the investigation of real criminal cases, I invite you to subscribe to my channel's Detective Brooks. Here you will find many impressive and intriguing stories from the world of criminology, learn about the work of investigators, and be able to immerse yourself in the atmosphere of detective investigations. Subscribe to the Detective Brooks channel to stay up to date with the most interesting investigations and amazing cases from the practice of law enforcement agencies. See you on the pages of exciting criminal stories.